Welcome. I would like to thank you all for joining us here today at our webinar on the use of international standards in LNG markets. I'm Kristen Madler. I work in USAID's Global Energy Division and manage USAID's Energy Utility Partnership Program. Today's webinar is organized by the U.S. Asia Gas Partnership, or AGP, a public-private partnership between government and industry representatives to optimize the development of secure, reliable, and economic sources of natural gas across the Asia Pacific. The partnership is designed to both highlight technical topics for regulators, utilities, and policymakers across the region, and to foster business development and networking. Best practice documents, technical standards, safety guidelines, and environmental regulations are shared with partners in emerging LNG importing countries across the Indo-Pacific. South and Southeast Asia will be the biggest LNG demand growth market in 2040, as demand from traditional importers in North Asia and Europe decline. Practical training and strategic advice are targeted at ministries and regulators, which aims to drive more informed policy and decision-making to increase investment. And this partnership includes a series of both live and recorded webinars featuring leading U.S. and international gas sector experts hosted by USAID's partners, the U.S. Energy Association, or USEA, and the National Association of Regulatory Utility Commissioners. I would like to thank USEA for their efforts to organize today's session. And today we'll dive into how standards play an integral role in attracting project investment, protecting workers and the environment, and reducing regulatory complexity for governments. The session will explore how American Petroleum Institute standards are developed in a consensus-based committee process, how companies and governments can access and utilize API standards, and how governments may reference comprehensive standards in their regulations and laws. The presenters will also focus on how international standards can help economies meet their requirements of the World Trade Organization Technical Barriers to Trade Agreement. So once again, I would like to thank you all for joining us today and look forward to seeing you virtually in an upcoming Asia Gas Partnership webinar session. If you haven't done so already, please register for upcoming webinars or listen to pre-recorded webinars in this series at usea.org. In closing, I would like to thank our speakers today for carving out time to share your unique perspectives with us. We greatly appreciate your time and commitment. And next, I would like to give the floor to Sarah Blanford at USEA to introduce today's speakers. Thank you.
Thanks, Kristen. I join Kristen in thanking all of our speakers for staying up late on this Wednesday night. We target our presentation time so that it can reach our target audience in Asia, which means our American friends here have to stay up late at night. So we thank them extra for that. Our first presenter tonight is Renee Hancher. Ms. Hancher is the USTR lead on good regulatory practices, otherwise known as GRP. And she covers GRP and regulatory cooperation matters in bilateral and regional trade negotiations, the WTO, the Asia Economic Cooperation Forum, and the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development. Before joining USTR, Ms. Hancher worked on standards, conformity assessment, technical barriers to trade, and GRP issues at the U.S. Department of Commerce, International Trade Administration, and she did that from 2005 to 2019. Prior to that, she spent 10 years directing the international trade work at the Air Conditioning, Heating, and Refrigeration Institute, an industry trade association. Ms. Hancher holds a BA in International Studies from American University and an MA in International Economics from Columbia University. So we thank Ms. Hancher very much for joining us, and I hand over the floor to her.
Thank you very much, and good evening to everyone. I'm very pleased to be able to join you for this interesting presentation, this session tonight, and I wanted to thank the organizers for inviting me and including me in this program. In the short time that I have, I wanted to provide a brief introduction to the relationship between regulations, standards, and good regulatory practices. If we could go to the next slide. So regulations are the rules that govern the everyday life of businesses and citizens. They're important for ensuring public health and safety, environmental protection, promoting economic growth, and other policy objectives. And there's no disputing that governments have the right to regulate to achieve legitimate public policy objectives. But the challenge in a globalized world with interconnected supply chains is to understand that regulatory decisions are no longer purely domestic, and to recognize that divergent regulations have costs, to consider all possible regulatory options, including the choice not to regulate at all, and to rely on international best practices. The image of the bridge that I have here has a couple of representations. The first one is it's the bridge between the different regulatory requirements that industry faces when doing business internationally. And it's very challenging to comply with differing, competing regulatory requirements in different markets. Yet the bridge also conveys that there's a way to connect those economies and those regulatory requirements and to better align them. And that bridge can be good regulatory practices. And so that's the focus of my next slide. So if we go to the next slide, I'm just going to give you a really brief tutorial on good regulatory practices. GRPs, as we call them, are essentially the rules for rulemaking. And so some examples of core good regulatory practices are things like including stakeholders in the development of regulations, relying on sound scientific information and evidence in decision making, and ensuring that internal government coordination happens so that regulations are developed to not be redundant or to have different objectives, but also to reduce regulatory burdens. And then finally, to produce the good regulatory practices can produce better quality regulations and positive net benefits for society. So good regulatory practices are given effect through the development of laws, rules, and guidance documents for regulators. And it's not enough that these things just exist on paper. They really have to be put into practice by a government. And when that happens, there's greater predictability and consistency about regulatory requirements that traders and investors crave. I've often heard companies say that they can comply with the rules, but the challenge is in knowing what the rules are in order to comply. And a lot of what good regulatory practice does is ensure transparency so that there can be compliance in any given market. When you have good regulatory practices, there's also stronger public support and buy-in to regulatory decisions when stakeholders know that they can provide input on proposed regulatory measures and that their input will be taken into account in a final outcome. Assessing the benefits and costs of proposed regulations and considering alternatives to regulation can reduce burdens on business, including small and medium enterprises, and also be beneficial to consumers. And when their GRPs are applied, this increases transparency about the rules and the benefits of when those rules are applied uniformly and consistently. If we can move to the next slide. This slide shows a number of GRPs that can help to minimize unnecessary regulatory differences and produce better regulatory outcomes. So I've identified a bunch of good regulatory practices here. These aren't all of them, but things like internal consultation and coordination, as I talked about, having a regulatory register with all the information about the rules, reviewing regulations that are on the books and getting rid of old and outdated regulations, those kinds of things. But the one that's highlighted in red and the one that I want to focus on that's most relevant for tonight is the use of international standards. If we can move to the next slide. So the World Trade Organization Agreement on Technical Barriers to Trade aims to ensure that technical regulations, standards, and conformity assessment procedures are not discriminatory and don't create unnecessary obstacles to trade. At the same time, the agreement recognizes that WTO members have the right to regulate and to achieve legitimate policy objectives. And so you'll see there's got to be that balance there between meeting objectives and not restricting trade. And just in case just as a refresher and in case you're not aware, the difference between standards and technical regulations is that standards are, by definition, voluntary measures, and they become mandatory when they're referenced in regulation. And that's when we call them technical regulations, and that's the primary focus of the TBT agreement. The TBT agreement also strongly encourages members to base their regulations on international standards as a means to facilitate trade. Additionally, government representatives are encouraged to participate in the development of standards in order to contribute to the content of the standard and then to assess whether the standard that's produced is fit for purpose and meets their regulatory needs. The TBT agreement doesn't name specific bodies that develop international standards. Instead, through a committee decision on international standards that was agreed to some 20 years ago, the focus is on the process whereby the standards are developed. And the process is supposed to include things like having transparency, openness, impartiality, and consensus, relevance and effectiveness, coherence, and takes into account developing country interests. So a standard that is developed consistent with those kinds of principles is considered to be an international standard. Now, through the transparency provisions of the TBT agreement, it requires certain things such as countries notifying draft technical regulations, allowing adequate time for public comment by interested persons, and enabling online access to information about regulatory requirements. Finally, since regulatory barriers are the most common non-tariff barrier that businesses encounter when they go into the international trade world, the use of good regulatory practices by governments can be trade facilitating by reducing or minimizing regulatory differences between countries. Next slide. Not too long ago, I listened to a presentation by a colleague from Australia who was also providing an introduction and an overview to standards to a relatively non-technical audience. And he explained it this way. He said, the good use of standards complements regulations. And I thought that that was very well said, and I used it for the title of this slide. Recall again that standards are by definition voluntary and only become mandatory when referenced in regulation. So reliance on standards produced by standards development organizations has a number of benefits for regulators. For example, in the United States, our regulators are required to look for existing standards that might meet their needs before creating government unique standards. This also underscores the point that government doesn't always have all the answers, and should cast a wide net before developing prescriptive requirements that may be inconsistent with international best practice. There are rules for how international standards are developed to create transparency and predictability. You know, we just talked about the TBT agreement and the definition of international standards. So those rules help to ensure transparency and predictability. Government reliance on work carried out by the private sector, by standards development organizations, can also free up government resources so they're not duplicating. It can free up resources to do other things and cut costs. And also, when practicable, voluntary solutions can be an alternative to regulation. By not locking into law a standard that may become quickly outdated, reliance on voluntary consensus standards actually encourages innovation and flexibility while drawing from the work of experts who possess the most up-to-date technical information, and it can also help to increase consumer choice in a marketplace. In my discussion of good regulatory practices and standards, you've heard a couple of words I've repeated a number of times: transparency, accountability, consensus, not trade restrictive. So there are clear parallels between good regulatory practices, the fundamental GRPs, and best practices in standards development. So using international standards can limit trade frictions and reduce barriers to trade and ensure that a country complies with its WTO obligations. And now to the final slide to just summarize. Industry wants transparency and consistency in the rules that it needs to meet across markets, and the use of good regulatory practices really helps to build regulatory alignment, and using international standards contributes to this. And applying good regulatory practices is a great way to facilitate commerce, both domestically within a country, but also among countries, and also a good way to attract investment. So thanks very much, and look forward to the rest of the presentations.
Thank you, Renee, very much. Now to introduce the rest of our team here. American Petroleum Institute was kind enough to be co-hosting and organizing this webinar with us. So today we have three representatives. We have David Miller, the Director of Standards Development at API, Alexa Burr, the Director of Systems Programs, Global Industry Services, and Ryan Nelson, Associate for API's Global Strategy and International Engagement. Just to briefly introduce the two of them that will be presenting today. David Miller is the Director of Standards Development at API. In this role, he is responsible for overall standards, policy, and oversight, and is a member of API's senior management staff. David also serves as Vice Chairman of the Board of Directors of the American National Standards Institute. He has served on several federally chartered advisory committees and has testified before Congress, federal, and state regulators on standards and technology issues. David is a registered professional engineer and has earned a BS in Civil Engineering from the University of Utah and an MS in Environmental Sciences from the University of Texas at Dallas. He joined API in 1985 and has been elected a fellow by the American Society of Civil Engineers and serves on their membership application review committee. And then I'll introduce Alexa. So Ms. Burr is the Director for Systems Programs in the Global Industry Services Division at the Institute. Her responsibilities include overseeing the strategic direction of GIS system programs, including the Process Safety Site Assessment Program and Pipeline Safety Management System Assessment Program. In this role, Ms. Burr develops, directs, and guides strategies to grow these API offerings, working in coordination with other GIS programs and with other external partners. Ms. Burr also oversees the implementation of the GIS Global Standards Strategy and advocates on behalf of the industry in various international forums to promote the use and adoption of industry standards to continuously improve environmental, health, safety, security, and sustainability performance globally. Very similar to what we're hoping to achieve with AGP. Prior to API, Ms. Burr worked at the American Chemistry Council in various roles where she oversaw the strategic direction of the Responsible Care Program and led international advocacy efforts on a range of issues from chemical management regulations to GHS to security issues. Ms. Burr holds an MS in biological threat agents and emerging infectious diseases and a BS in biology of global health, both from Georgetown University and Washington, D.C. So I now pass the floor over to David and Alexa. Thank you.
Great, thank you. So this is David. Again, thank you for the kind introduction and for the opportunity to participate in this evening's or this morning's or midday's event. We appreciate the chance to talk about these important issues with our colleagues from around the world. So I'm going to give the overview of the American Petroleum Institute and particularly our standards development program. So if we could go to the next slide, please. So as you heard Renee say, you know, when we talk about, you know, good regulatory practice and the use of standards in there, we will have a focus on that today, and then Alexa will give some great examples of how they're being utilized both here and in international applications as well. But if we go to the next slide, I'll talk just for a minute about the American Petroleum Institute. We are a national trade association based in Washington, D.C. So we are a nonprofit organization. You know, many people will be confused since we're in Washington and since it's API that we're somehow part of the government. We are not. We are funded by our members. We have approximately 600 corporate members that are involved in all aspects of the global natural gas and oil industry. Starting off at the top of this slide, we have, of course, you know, the large integrated oil companies, or IOCs as we call them, all those names that are very familiar to ExxonMobil, BP, Shell, Total, Equinor, and others as well. But then we also have the opportunity for the organizations involved in very specific parts of the industry to participate as well. And that's one thing that makes us a bit unique as a trade association for this particular industry, is that we cover the entire value chain, if you will, of the natural gas and oil industry. So starting off with upstream, we have companies that are specifically involved in just upstream or exploration and production activities. Our midstream, which are of course the organizations that are involved in pipeline and transport. Downstream, which are our refiners and marketers. And then finally, we have quite a few members and large companies as well involved in the service and supply. So those are the organizations that provide services and supply materials and products and design engineering to all of the different segments of the industry. So that's API in a nutshell. We are just now celebrating our 101st year. We had our centennial year last year. So we have been around as an organization for quite some time. So if we could go to the next one, please. Alexa, Ryan, and myself are all involved in API's Global Industry Services Division. And you can see our mission statement there is to provide world-class services that enable the oil and natural gas industry to operate, you know, efficiently, safely, reliably, profitably, which is important, of course, these days. And then what's even more important is sustainably. So our organization, or our division of the American Petroleum Institute, is a little over 100 employees with 145 contract auditors, and we really are global. We do work all around the world. In addition to our offices in Washington, D.C., we have 2 offices in New York, we have an office in Rio, we have an office in Beijing, and we have an office in Dubai. So we do have global reach, and as you can see from this particular slide, we do have quite a few programs here, training programs, publications, events, a large personal certification program with over 56,000 certifications in 128 different countries. And those are the individuals that typically will be inspecting operations at plants and other facilities, and then our company certifications and our licensed products. So we are truly a global organization. We're roughly about 1/3 of the American Petroleum Institute's total headcount or employment, and a little over half of the revenue that comes through the organization comes through these different programs and products and services that we provide to the industry. So next, please. But what we're going to talk now about in particular is API standards. And so as you can see, we've been setting standards since 1924. So essentially, as long as there's been an API, there's been an API standards program. It was one of the foundational programs that the Institute was founded on back in 1919. Our standards promote safety, environmental protection, reliability, and sustainability through proven engineering practices. As I mentioned, much like the API is an organization that represents all of the value chains for the petroleum and natural gas industry, our standards do as well. We have standards that cover upstream, downstream, and midstream. We are accredited by the American National Standards Institute. We'll talk a bit about that in a minute. We're now up to 700 standards. So our first standard that was published in 1924 was an exploration and production standard. We're now up over 700 standards covering the entire value chain for the industry. And we have a number of citations in the U.S. Code of Federal Regulations. Over 650 citations of our standards appear in the federal regs. So next, please. I'm going to spend just a minute now talking about our accreditation with the American National Standards Institute, or ANSI. Some of you may be familiar with ANSI. ANSI is the U.S. national standards body that has been designated to provide accreditation of standards developing organizations like API. There are currently roughly a little over 200 organizations that are accredited under ANSI's program. What that accreditation calls for is that we conduct our standards development work in accordance with their 4 pillars of openness, balance, consensus, and due process. And so at API, our openness includes the fact that you don't have to be a corporate member to serve on an API standards committee. We look for a set of balanced interests for the individuals who develop our standards. So we don't want just the large oil companies or just the service and supply or just the consultants writing our standards. We look for a balance on our committees. We develop and promote and finish all of our work under the rules of consensus, which we define at API as having at least 2/3 majority approval of a standards action, which is revision of a standard or creation of a new standard or withdrawal of a standard. And at least 50% plus 1 return. We do all of our work now, like most organizations, completely remotely. We had instituted a e-balloting system back in 2000, actually. And so since we've instituted that, our returns are much higher than that, but that's our minimum. And then finally, due process. It's very important for us to let everyone know that when you provide comments on an API standard, that we will go back and advise you how those comments were treated, what the next steps in the process are, and of course, have a formal appeals process. So those are the 4 pillars that ANSI accreditation calls for. You also have to have approved and published procedures, which we do. You have to have a requirement for standards update. Our cycle time for standards being updated is every 5 years. And then finally, if that's not enough under ANSI, we also undergo a regular program audit. So ANSI will come out on a 5-year cycle, which ties into the number of times that our standards are updated, and they'll make sure that we're following all of these different criteria by taking a selection of the standards that have been published since the previous audit. Just for information, our next audit comes up early next year. So that's a little about ANSI. I know I spent more than just a few minutes on it, but it is very important for everyone to understand that our process is very rigorous, that our process has transparency, and that our process is one that organizations and key stakeholders, including government officials, can trust. And as you saw by the number of citations, certainly in the US, that's the case. So next, please. So we'll talk a little bit about the transparency. Again, it's transparent, impartial, and consensus-based process. It's driven by research, data, and science-based decisions. As a trade association that's focused on just one industry, we're able to actually take some of the additional revenue that comes in from the sales of our publications and actually invest it in the standards themselves. And so we do some basic fundamental research at API to update the data that goes into our standards or when we create new standards. As I said, the committees that write our standards are completely open. We have right now in our database a little over 7,000 individuals from the industry, from academia, government, and NGOs, representing over 2,200 different organizations. So it's a very broad program, a very deep program with lots of peer review built into the process. We do collaborate with other standards bodies to avoid duplication and connect globally. We have agreements in place with organizations like the International Oil and Gas Producers Association based in London. We have a whole series of MOUs that I'm happy to say that, that Alexa and Ryan handle for us and make sure that they're operationalized. But we really want to avoid that duplication. But in areas where we do need to develop new standards, we'll certainly, of course, do that. And then we incorporate those proven engineering practices into those standards and update them regularly. So next, please. So next slide, there we go. So for the engineers on the call, and there might be a few besides myself, this is a flow chart. We all love flow charts. I won't take you through this, but this just shows you the standards development process from initiation to approval to the balloting, the consensus approval stage, the editorial, and then finally the publication. And it's really just to show you what a robust and rigorous process it is. There are many places for people to have input into the standards development process. We have online now an online application. So if there are any of the international folks that would like to participate in the standards development process at API, it's completely open. This just gives you a sense of how this process works. So next, please. So again, talking about our committees, they're developed by the subcommittees and task groups based on from the industry experts from around the world. We have participants from the oil and gas companies, of course, the manufacturers and consultants, the government agencies, and the academia that have expertise in the standards topic. So the only criteria that we have for participating in a standards development process at API is that you have expertise in the area, and that depending on what kind of organization you're from, that you have approval from your organization to fully participate in the process to make sure that we have, the ability of people to contribute to the standards. And then, of course, as I said, we have a very transparent and public balloting process. You might remember Renee talking about the need for transparency in their work. Well, it's important for our work as well. So if we can go to the next slide. This talks about our transparency. So we have a standards plan that is displayed online in real time. And what I mean by that is all of the standards that we're working on throughout the entire year are shown in the standards plan that's driven by our standards tracking database in 3 different phases. The pre-ballot phase is when we're developing the text for the standard itself, and that's the opportunity for organizations to participate in the process. The ballot phase, of course, moves into that formal ballot phase, and that's also at a time when that provides a link to our website where our all balloting link shows you all of the documents that are being balloted at any given time in API and allows you the opportunity to comment on those documents. And then finally, of course, once the balloting and consensus phase is completed, it moves into in-editing. But in addition to that, so that's the transparency in the development side. In the publication side, or in the use by the incorporation by reference, we have what's called an incorporated by reference, or IBR reading room, where all of the standards that have been incorporated by reference at a federal level are available for free online access to make sure that all of the public members who may fall under the requirements of a regulation that references an API standard have that opportunity to take a look at the documents at any time that they would like to. So again, as Renee said, transparency in all this work is very important, and it's important for the standards development as well. So next, please. So here's a summary here. We've got about 700 standards. They're incorporated by both the federal and the state regulators, but we also have the international citations as well. In the states, here in the United States, of course, they've got 3,800 citations of API standards, which just makes sense. If you think about the states, they're either going to have exploration and production activities, they'll have midstream or pipeline activities. They certainly have service stations. And of course, we have standards on all those different things. And then, as I've mentioned, the 650 citations by the federal agencies, and it's all the agencies that you might expect that would be citing these. But when we get into international, I do have some new information for you and some work that's been led by Alexa and Ryan's team. So next, please. So this is the information that I can share with you, and this report is on the API's website for free download. We've done some work and we've analyzed 25 different markets, and we've saw, a widespread use of the API standards with over 780 references, and then the references are broken down there in the pie charts and giving you an idea of the number of references used in national standards and regulations. So we can see now that in addition to the broad use of API standards and regulations in the United States, we're also seeing increased use around the world. So if we can go to the next slide. So this is my last one before I get to pass the baton to Alexa. The way that these standards are used in that international report, we find that some of the governmental bodies will use them as references in their technical manuals. Sometimes they'll be incorporated and or referenced in their national standards. So if you think about a country may say, well, the national standard for this country for line pipe, for example, is the API specification 5L on line pipe. So they may be incorporated that way, or they can be incorporated directly or referenced in the regulations, much as they're done in the United States. And then it really falls to the agency discretion to make a determination as Renee mentioned, standards of and in themselves are voluntary until they're picked up either in a regulation or in someone's contract. So they're voluntary up until that point, until the agencies decide how they need to use them, and they can either be mandatory or voluntary based on the policy objectives. So that is a quick overview of API standards and an update on some very exciting work in the international world that Alexa and Ryan have put together. And I'll now pass the baton to Alexa.
Perfect. Thank you, David. So now that you all have heard about the importance of using standards as a basis for policies and how API standards are developed in a consensus-based process, I'm going to share some case studies with you to show how various regulators across the world utilize and reference API standards into their policies, regulations, and guidance documents. So next slide, please. So starting out with the US, in the US, we have a federal policy, the National Technology Transfer and Advancement Act. So what does that actually mean? So this policy is applicable to all federal US agencies, which are generally equivalent to ministries, which is just a naming difference. And this policy states that when regulatory agencies are contemplating developing or updating a regulation, that they should utilize technical standards that have been developed in a voluntary consensus-based process. That they should incorporate those technical standards into the policy as a way of really encouraging transparency and leveraging work that's already been done and agreed upon by subject matter experts. This policy also states that all agencies should consult with those voluntary consensus-based standards bodies as the subject matter experts on particular regulations when they're debating whether or not to develop a new regulation or modify a regulation. Lastly, it also states that federal agencies should participate in that voluntary standards development process. So as David mentioned, we often have regulators that participate on our standards committees, and it's really important from both a standards body perspective as well as the government, so that they can participate in developing the standards that often are the basis of their regulatory policies. In the US, we additionally have from the Office of Management and Budget, which oversees a lot of the procedural aspects of how the US government works. They have a document called Circular A-119. This policy states that agencies, again, must use voluntary consensus standards in lieu of government unique standards in their procurement and regulatory activities. This really highlights what Renee was already talking about, how regulatory agencies can depend on those existing standards instead of creating unique or duplicative or slightly different regulatory policies. The goal of this is to really reduce that duplication, both which will benefit the regulatory agency in reducing their time it takes to develop a regulation, as well as reducing the regulatory burden and potential confusion on from the perspective of industry. So next slide, please. So as to bolster this, there are two main ways that federal agencies in the US use these voluntary consensus-based standards. The first here is incorporating by reference. Basically, this means taking or adopting a standard without any changes and including it in the text of a regulation. This then makes what we have called the standard is incorporated. This means that the standard becomes mandatory as a part of that regulation. The benefits to this approach include eliminating the cost of the regulator for increased burden and time of developing a regulation, which many folks on the line probably know takes quite a while. But it also eliminates costs on the industry for creating a new standard and detailed regulations, and instead really leverages what already exists oftentimes. The second way that is used by the US government to incorporate standards is leveraging parts of a standard. So maybe an entire standard, which could be up to 200 pages, might not be completely applicable, but they can take parts of a standard, so it's partially incorporated, and include that in regulations. So next slide, please. So in terms of some real life examples as to how this is done, I will share some case studies in the US, but also from around the world, as to different ways regulatory agencies approach including and leveraging the existing standards and API standards in their regulations. So first, starting with, in the US, the Bureau of Safety Environmental Enforcement, or BSEE, is the offshore oil and gas regulator, and a lot of their activity and regulatory jurisdiction, they oversee the Gulf of Mexico, where there's a lot of oil and gas activity and production. API, Recommended Practice 75, is API's standard for offshore oil and gas operations and their safety and environmental management system. So making sure that all complex systems across operations are promoting safety and environmental provisions. So BSEE, the regulator, has incorporated API-RP 75 by reference into their offshore regulation in whole. And I actually pulled the direct text from their regulation here that you can see in the middle of the slide. And they specifically mentioned API-RP 75 in the second to last line there, as incorporated by reference. So this means that API-RP 75 is therefore mandatory for all operators that are working in the Gulf of Mexico. And so as part of this regulation, BSEE's regulation, they do require all operators to be audited every 3 years as a checking mechanism to make sure that the operators are actually implementing and using and meeting the requirements of API-RP 75, as well as additional requirements as laid out in their offshore regulation. So this is just an example of that first option of completely incorporating by reference in whole without any changes, a standard into a regulation. Next slide, please. Perfect. So the second case study we have here, switching from offshore operations in the oil and gas industry to midstream operations or pipeline. Pipeline safety is, of course, essential to our industry. Many products and goods are transported across pipeline, whether it's LNG, petroleum, pipelines are used everywhere. So having a safety system, which API has RP Recommended Practice 1173, which includes provisions for pipeline safety management systems. So making sure that operators are including processes and implementing processes to maintain the safety and integrity of pipelines. So for some quick background on API Recommended Practice 1173, there were a number of pipeline incidents between 2010, 2012, and the U.S. National Transportation Safety Board, or NTSB, as one of their recommendations, recommended that the industry develop a pipeline safety management system to improve performance and try to prevent some of these incidents from happening in the future. So API, as the standard setting body for the oil and gas industry, began the process for developing a standard on this topic. We formed a standards committee, similar to how David mentioned. We received volunteers. We had representatives from industry, as well as the public, as well as the United States Pipeline and Hazardous Materials Safety Administration, or PHMSA as we refer to it here. We also had representatives from the NTSB, as well as state and local pipeline safety regulators from around the country. This really demonstrates how our standards committees are made up of so many different stakeholders. So this slide is a little complicated, but it shows the process leading up to the standards development process and how long it takes to develop one of these consensus-based standards, somewhat similar to developing a regulation because of all the stakeholder consultation we do that David mentioned. So finally, in 2015, we finalized API-RP 1173, which is the framework for pipeline safety management systems. Next slide, please. So as I mentioned, PHMSA, the pipeline regulator, they participated in the standards development process. However, they currently do not incorporate the standard by reference into their regulation. So this is different as how from BSEE, the first example I just gave. But rather, PHMSA and NTSB are strong supporters of this as they did participate in the development of the standards, and they often encourage pipeline operators to develop and implement API-RP 1173 in their own pipeline safety management systems. And while they haven't incorporated this to make it mandatory into regulations, they do in some cases require operators to implement 1173 after an incident, basically as an enforcement action or an identified opportunity for improvement for operators to try and prevent incidents, any pipeline incidents from happening in the future. Next slide, please. Moving to Indonesia, one great example of how the Ministry of Energy and Mineral Resources in Indonesia, which oversees all oil and gas activities and regulations in Indonesia, they have a broad overarching regulation that requires oil and gas companies to guarantee the effective standard and quality, as well as apply good technical forms throughout their operations. So that's really the broad overarching regulation. And then in 2018, they also issued a regulation which requires the oil and gas sector to comply with 4 mandatory standards from the Indonesian standards body, or BSN. However, of course, oil and gas operations use far more than 4 standards across the entire value chain. Therefore, the regulation states that when no applicable mandatory BSN standards or Indonesian national standards exist, the regulation does permit oil and gas companies to adopt voluntary standards from other international bodies, many of which are from API. And they specifically list acceptable international standards, which 140 of API standards are actually on this list. I wanted to call out API standard 521, which is included on this list, and 521 is often included in, and used when building LNG facilities and petroleum facilities, because it helps design pressure relieving piping systems. So it's included on that list of 140 acceptable international standards by the Indonesian government. And then it's also included in a number of work procedure guidelines that are issued by the Indonesian government that are focused on preventing process safety events from happening, and included in work procedures to enhance occupational safety for workers. Next slide, please. Switching regions of the world, I also want to include an example from Brazil. So Brazil's national nonprofit standards development organization is the Brazilian Association of Technical Standards, or ABNT, and they develop a significant number of national standards in Brazil, many of which are voluntary, but also are referenced by regulators in Brazil, similar to Indonesia and in the US. So within ABNT, there are a number of technical committees, similar to what David just mentioned as APIs committees, that are responsible for developing standards. They've actually issued over 400 standards related to the oil and gas sector. However, many of those standards, they actually make references to API standards, and there are over, in 19 of ABNT standards, there are over 50 normative references to API standards. So really, they do a great job of leveraging the existing international standards that, so that they don't have to duplicate or create their own standards, but can really leverage the work that API standards committees have already done. This helps create alignment across the industry. It helps leverage and facilitate trade by having alignment and standards so that companies operating in the US can know which standards to use and in Brazil and which are accepted and recognized by ABNT. So I also just wanted to highlight ABNT's use and inclusion of API Standard 620. They make multiple references to this standard because it is often used in the design and construction of large storage tanks, which are used in LNG facilities and petroleum facilities and are really essential to the industry. So this, while not incorporated by reference into any regulation, ABNT does reference Standard 620 among many other API standards, really increasing the use of that alignment that I mentioned throughout the market in Brazil. So next slide, please. So just to conclude, as Renee mentioned, the use of standards and policies can help facilitate trade, benefiting governments and industry alike by helping to create transparent, effective regulations that leverage international best practices to protect the environment and health and safety of our communities. Using standards can help reduce regulatory burdens while meeting those WTO and GRP requirements. And reducing that regulatory burden is not only in the interest of industry, but also in the interest of regulators, helping them make the regulatory development more efficient and creating regulatory alignment across economies. So by reducing these burdens on government and industry and leveraging international standards, again, it helps facilitate the use of high quality standards that help protect environment, health, and safety. And also by improving efficiencies in the regulatory development process and in industry, it helps spur economic growth and strengthen countries' infrastructure as it relates to the energy sector. And ultimately, this helps deliver those key low-cost energy products to those who need it most. So with that, I think that is the last slide, and I will turn it back to Sarah and Kristen. So thank you everyone for having us tonight.
Thank you, Alexa. That was great. Thank you, David, too. All right, let's open it up to see if we have any. So anyone who has a question, just go ahead and you can type it into the Q&A. We have no questions yet, but I guess while we're waiting for people to type, I will pose a couple of questions. David, you had mentioned that the API coordinates with other standards bodies to avoid duplication, which seems on the surface to be kind of a no-brainer. But can you clarify, why is this actually important? Like, I'm imagining, what's the harm in two different standards organizations having the same? It seems on the surface that it would be a good idea if standards organizations had similar standards.
Sure. So a good example of why we coordinate is the standards that we develop cooperatively with ASTM, which is the Testing and Materials Organization here in the US. And what that allows us to do is to have a single set of standards for test methods in a laboratory. And that way, regardless of where the product is being tested for, say, quality and purity, they're going to be using the same tests at the facility. So it provides a consistency. And if I'm someone who is, interested in either purchasing or producing these products, and I want to be able to buy the products from a variety of sources, I know that if I get a test report from laboratory A or from laboratory B, I know that if it's run against that same common set of standards, I can compare those results and then make that informed decision. In addition to that, it's also very important to recognize, just the very large resource requirements that goes into standards development. So anytime you have the opportunity to be more efficient and to develop just one standard between two organizations on the same topic, that saves resources. And the largest cost, if you will, of developing these standards is always going to be, the subject matter experts that provide, just hours upon hours helping API, ASTM, ISO, other organizations develop those standards. So anytime we can be more efficient there, that's also a win for everyone.
Okay, that makes more sense. Thank you.
You're
Still
welcome.
waiting for Q&A here. Sorry, I've launched on, so I'll keep asking questions until somebody else poses one. I also wanted to ask, along that same line, does API, I understand there are plenty of organizations that would end up utilizing API standards, but is there, on an international stage, does API coordinate with directly with other international bodies to help them develop their standards? Is there kind of a technical assistance arm to it? Or do you just kind of say, you know, off the shelf, this is a product, you guys could use this and amend it how you see fit?
Mm-hmm. So we do have, as I mentioned, we do have memorandums of understanding with different international organizations. In addition to the International Organization of Oil and Gas Producers, or IOGP, we have a whole series of MOUs that we've been signing that involve our coordination work and our standards development and capacity building work with other organizations. And so I don't know if either Alexa or Ryan might want to talk about, you know, some of the more recent MOUs that we've signed and how they help us, you know, leverage that expertise to the benefit of both organizations.
Absolutely, thanks, David. And that's a good question, Sarah. And we realize, you know, the oil and gas industry is a global industry. It's a global supply chain. So by signing some of these MOUs with other international partners and standard setting bodies, we want to have their experts participate in our standards development process and then go back to their home countries and create standards that are in alignment or leverage the use of API standards. So what I was talking about a bit with the Brazilian national standards body is how they actually reference or normative reference API standards. So basically incorporating API standards into their own national standards. And this really creates more alignment in the use of standards, which makes it easier for the industry to operate efficiently and trade products that we know, in one country, we're meeting all the necessary standards here. And if there's alignment in the use of those standards in other countries, it's much easier to export products to that country.
Sorry, that makes sense. Thank you very much. Mr. Bangesh Brahm, I see that your hand was raised kind of in the middle of one of the presentations. I'm going to allow you to speak if you still have that question. Mr. Brahm, can you hear us? Okay, well, I'll put his hand down. He can pop up if he has. We just have one more minute and I'm gonna just hog the stage here. Questions, I guess. What keeps a country from not, I mean, you're putting so much work and transparency and your process is so good. What prevents a country from just keeping it simple and adopting an API standard? Why would they bother to go through the work of developing their own? I mean, I could see taking one of yours and tailoring it a bit, but obviously there's plenty of countries that haven't. So what's holding them back, do you think?
I would just say that I'd look for either Alexa or Renee to comment on that, but oftentimes you may have regulatory requirements that are very specific to different industries that may have those requirements that their standards be uniquely domestic, if you will. I don't know if either Alexa or Renee might have a different thought on that particular question. It's a good question, but I'll see if my colleagues have a better answer.
So one question we often get is, if you have your API, you're the American Petroleum Institute, but you have these standards. If I'm in a different country, can I still use an API standard if it's an American standard? And yes, there's a lot of confusion around that. And as David pointed out, we have over 700 references to API standards across the globe from regulators. While there is some confusion there, the WTO TBT agreement encourages the use of consensus-based standards as a basis for technical regulations, and API is accredited by ANSI. While we have a slightly different standards organization in the US than some other countries, the API standards are still meet those those hard criteria that ANSI sets out to make sure that we are an accredited organization and meet those the necessary requirements to be accredited. So not sure if Renee wants to add anything.
Thanks, thanks, Alexa. Thanks, David. I mean, you've covered a lot of it. I mean, sometimes there might be a need for a country to, because of its specific practices, they might need to, look and transpose the API standard into their domestic law. They might need to make specific modifications for unique requirements. There are allowances for that, even though they are to use international standards. I mean, they might need to make minor tweaks based on climatic conditions or, something like that. So that can often be the case. But ideally, there's going to be a possibility for them to look at what API's done and take that into account as something they can use also it could be beneficial if they're like if it's in a region too. Like Alexa talked about Brazil, but certainly we have the U.S. Canada Mexico agreement, and so working together, the three economies can use the same standards, and it could be the case too in other regional trading arrangements where that could be beneficial to rely on the same standard.
Thank you, Renee, very much. We have received a couple additional questions, but unfortunately we're out of time, excuse me. So we will capture these questions and share them with our panelists, and we will share the answers with everyone that is registered, the few hundred people that have registered for this program. And if anyone has additional questions, feel free to reach out to me at USEA. It's sblanford@usea.org. And I'll type that into the chat room as well. But on behalf of USAID and U.S. Energy Association, I want to give my deepest of thanks to our API team, Ryan, Alexa, and David, and to Renee at USTR. We greatly, greatly appreciate your expertise. This is, your involvement is completely voluntary. You're giving up your time, and you're giving up your time late at night. And I know all of our participants on the other side of the world really appreciate it. We need this kind of collaboration more than ever, be it from our living rooms and kitchen tables. So we thank you. We wish everyone a good evening, and we will reach out to everyone via email with a copy of the video and the PowerPoints and the answers to these questions. So I thank you all, and I wish you a very good night.
Thank you. Good night.